Good evening, everyone, and welcome again to the Cathedral, and how wonderful it is to have a lecture here this evening. It's wonderful to see so many people. It really is heartwarming to know that you all still want to come and hear our ADFAS lectures. Just a couple of notices for you. Next month, we expect to be back to the Hunter School of the Performing Arts. We do say a special thank you to the Cathedral for hosting us, but we will be going back to the school. You will get in the notes from the chair, we'll give you more information about that. And the other one that I wanted just to raise quickly with you was to say thank you for your support of Young Arts. Those of you who bought raffle tickets as you came in, that's where the money from the raffles goes to, Young Arts. And as you know, we won the Marsh Awards, and a large part of that was Young Arts as well as School of Arts. The other thing is a number of members have asked, can they make a donation to Young Arts? The answer is yes. In our next notes from the chair, we'll add a little piece that if you wish to make a donation, you just fill that in and follow the instructions. But tonight we're very fortunate to have a very special lady who was supposed to come last year and give this lecture. But of course, things got in the way and Julie wasn't able to come. But we're delighted that she agreed to come and give this lecture this year. Julie Ewington is a writer, curator and broadcaster. She's based in Sydney. She's an authority on contemporary Australian art, especially art by women, and contemporary art from Southeast Asia. She has held both academic and curatorial positions, always focusing on contemporary art. Her interests extend from feminism to cosmopolitanism, from installation to jewellery, from museum projects to cultural resistance. In 2014, Julie received the Australian Council's Visual Arts Award to honour her achievements as a curator, writer and advocate for the visual arts. And tonight, we're very fortunate, she's going to talk about 4 women artists. They're artists from the Venice Biennale. Simran Gill, Fiona Hall, Tracy Moffatt and Angelica Masiti have all been shown in the Australian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. We ask, what is the significance and outcome of this hotly contested opportunity? Tonight, Julie's going to give us the answer to that, and I'd like you all to welcome her to the lectern now, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, for that very warm welcome. Can everybody hear me? Even down the back? Oh, some hands are raised. That is excellent. Thank you very much. It was a shame not to be able to come last year, but then most of last year was a shame anyway. And this year is being terrible for some friends and family in other countries, as we know. But I'm very happy to be here in this very beautiful church speaking to you tonight. I should just also say, as a way of introduction, it's a bit of a thrill to be here because my mother came from Newcastle. This is where my grandfather and grandmother settled and brought up their 8 children. And the family has been living in this area until really only the last 3 or 4 for half a dozen years. Huge family, and for all I know, there are cousins out there that I don't know where to find. I should say that my grandfather, Ernest Deed, was the harbour master. We were very proud that he was the harbour master of Newcastle Harbour from 1926 to 1934, and his son, also Captain Ernest Deed, was subsequently the harbour master. So we had, and then his son was the senior pilot. So we had 3 generations in the harbour service here in Newcastle, and very proud we were of our maritime background. Very quickly, my grandfather and his 3 eldest sons was the first person to chart Lake Macquarie. And what you know today as Chain Valley Bay was once called Marjorie's Bay after my mother. Yes, she would love to know that you have applauded. Right, 4 women. As Cathy said, 4 women represented Australia at 4 successive Venice Biennales in 2013, 15, 17 and 19. What an opportunity that is. What an opportunity that will be when the art shows get back together. This is my own little snap of me sending a postcard from Murano to the children in my family. And this is to remind us that Venice has been a tourist site at least since the early 19th century, at least then, because by that stage the fabulous Republic had lost its great economic power. It's a maritime story again. They really lost because they failed to modernise their navy, which is a solitary story for all of us. Who has been to Venice here? Or rather, I should ask who has not been. So who has been? Oh my goodness, what a forest of hands. Then perhaps like me, you are beguiled by its great beauty and its astonishing history. So there we have Venice. But since it's been a tourist site, and very cleverly so, Venice has known how to attract people, and it has run biennales of art forms since 1893, which is when the first one was established. And now, of course, it has biennales of architecture, of dance. It has, of course, the Venice Film Festival, and theatre, a biennale of theatre. So it's a fantastic opportunity for any cultural-minded tourists, which I know ADFAS people very often are. The superlative beauty of Venice, the lure of a grand international art event. You can see why Australians and many others flock to Venice every 2 years to see the Venice Biennale. There were around 615,000 at the Venice Biennale in 2017, and in 2019, over 600,000. That's actually less than go to the Biennale of Sydney, but it's still a very good number. And of course, it is spectacular. This is my own photograph. It was an astonishing day in 2015. There was a storm coming in across the lagoon and across the bacino, which is what I photographed there. As the rain was threatening, there was a flock of people by the side who could not resist trying to capture the astonishing light. So first of all, I want to talk about why this International Art Festival, which is very, very important, draws us back to Venice every 2 years, and what Australia's done in recent years and why. So, the Venice Biennale is the biggest art show in any town, and of all the international biennials and triennials that showcase contemporary art, it's the oldest and in many ways the grandest, the most prestigious. The Venice Biennale was, as I said, first presented in 1895, which was the year before the first modern Olympics. And it's also sometimes referred to as, the Olympics of art, contemporary art. The project was the product of the same sort of 19th century interest in global interaction. And that's one sign of modernity that's never waned. This was expressed through deliberately attracting tourists to the high-end art event. So since 1895, Venice Biennale has been a showcase of contemporary art, though at nearly 50 years old, the Sydney Biennale is also one of the oldest in the world. But Venice, I think, still remains supreme. Now, this proliferation of international contemporary art shows on this gargantuan scale has been a real marker of the interest in contemporary art in our times. And I'll deal later at the end of the lecture with the question that must be in your mind: what's going to happen from now on in, given COVID and given the terrific battering that international tourism and travel has taken. But in the meantime, let's just hold that thought and have a look at where in Venice the show is actually held. Now, I know that some of you are going to get an image on the side screen that's got really great definition, so sometimes when this one gets too big, look at the side screen, because they're very clear and sharp under Robert's excellent technical guidance over here. If you look at the map, you can see what happens if you try to Google Venice Biennale venues on your phone. That's a screenshot. You can see that the various, particularly the main island, is absolutely peppered with Venice Biennale exhibitions. But for the most part, it's held in 2 venues. The first one is in the Giardini del Castello, the Gardens of the Castle. And that's right down at the very pointy end of Venice to the east. Right down at the pointy end, almost off the slide. And the other place is the Arsenale, which was the headquarters of the Venetian Navy and is the most astonishing historical site to explore if you've never been there. This here is the entry to the Arsenale. The ships would come, the galleys would come out of there just very quickly. They put the galleys in the water at the very back, and then like an assembly line, they would run them out, equipping them with rope, with stores, with sailors, with whatever, and they would run it right down this long, long yard, and by the time it came out of these gates here, it was ready to go into the bacino and into the lagoon and into war. It was an astonishing thing, absolutely astonishing. This down here with the trees is the gardens, and that there on the right-hand side is the main pavilion in the gardens. So from 1895 or 1893, when the when the city first decided to have the Biennale, they started building on these gardens, right? Now, the gardens had once been the private gardens of the castle, but Napoleon conquered Venice in one of his sweeps as a very young man through Europe, and he thoughtfully turned the castle gardens into a public park. And so they remained. And then after 18 months, he gave Venice to the Austrians, which was not a happy result for the Venetians at all. But it stayed a public park. And in that public park is where the buildings for the Biennale were built. And here you see the kind of crowds that you see, and please observe the tour guide and the umbrella. That's us sometimes. So today the Venice Biennale is a truly fascinating project. It's a kind of snapshot of where contemporary artists are going, because there is an official exhibition in the main pavilion that I showed you, and then there are 29 national pavilions in the Giardini with their own dedicated buildings. As I said, it started in 1895, so the 120th anniversary was in 2015. The next Biennale, which is going to happen next year, delayed for 1 year by COVID, will be number 59. And this is much more than an exhibition. It's like a gargantuan festival which spreads out even past the Giardini, even past the Arsenale, all over the city. Judy, you said that you were at the Venice Biennale. Who else has been to the Biennale of Art in this? A few people. Well, honestly, it's just astonishing. There's much more art than anybody could see, and it doesn't matter how hard you walk and how much shoe leather you wear out over 5 or 6 days. You leave Venice discovering that there was something that you have missed. It's actually bigger than Ben-Hur, actually. So these are some of the pavilions in the gardens to give you an idea of the neoclassical and Art Deco building that took place in the first part of the 20th century. Germania, and yes, Hitler did intervene to make it look more imposing and impressive, something that has embarrassed subsequent German artists. They are always fiddling with the architecture of the German pavilion in order to distance themselves from its deliberately overpowering style and the politics that lay behind that. Poor things. Canada has recently, that doesn't exist, a most unfortunate modern experiment which has been revised recently, but I haven't been able to see it because I haven't been obviously there for 2 years. France, a nice little kind of neoclassical pediment up the top right. And this truly distinguished building here done by the great Austrian modern architect Joseph Hoffmann, which is a beautiful, plain, simple box. And here you see in 2015 the entrance to the Arsenale. It's old, cavernous warehouse spaces, particularly a really, really, really long building. Like, I don't know how many meters long this particular building is, but it is called the Cordelier, and it's the rope-making factory part of the Arsenale. And back in the day, you used to be able to see a channel in the middle of the floor where the huge maritime ropes were made. That's been floored over, but I was there once in the early 90s and I saw the channel. Right? Amazing, absolutely amazing. You see a person with a maritime background loves that part of Venice. It's too wonderful. Now, these are the two main sites, as I said. And so I'm just going to take you through some of what you can see when you are on the main sites. But as I said, you can go all over Venice, from Cannaregio to the islands. We had to go to the Armenian monastery on one of the islands one year to see the Armenian pavilion, the Punto della Dogana, which is the old customs house, now renovated into an art museum by a French millionaire, Palazzi along the Grand Canal. Most astonishing places open up and you can see the shows in them. But at any rate, it's, as I said, the biggest show in town. Now, up until 2019, which was the last Art Biennale, it had become also very big business, a kind of unseemly jostle for prestige by the national competitors, both powerful and aspiring. And anachronistically, perhaps, prizes are still awarded. I heard one year that, having been awarded a prize, the British artist Anish Kapoor wept. And I said, is that because he's wept for joy? No, they said. He wept because he didn't get the Golden Lion. He got the award for the emerging artist. Well, that was the gossip around the pavilions at any rate. In 2017, Germany did win the Best Pavilion for a very challenging work that speaks about contemporary society and the state, an astonishing thing, and I'll show you a couple of photographs. But I guess the basic question is the Venice Biennale more than a kind of tawdry competition between artists and exhibitors and gallerists and hangers-on, all trying for fame and fortune and sales, and all of them, at least in the week of the professional preview, drinking an inordinate number of Aperol Spritz, right? Inordinate, right? It is not an edifying spectacle in some ways, as one is queuing and shoving and trying to see work in a context where there are 30,000 other people all trying to see it at once. However, and this is where the Australian artists come in and the support that they get from the Australia Council, it does bring maximum exposure. And those 30,000 professionals, amongst them curators and gallerists, see work from around the world, pick it up, include it in exhibitions, offer shows to artists, and sales do come from this, and this is really important. So not only Europeans, but in fact very many Australians attend. It's a great showcase for Australian artists to our own art lovers. And one of the things that we've done for many years is that once this show has been shown in Venice, it's very often brought back to Australia and shown in major cities with support. So that, for example, Fiona Hall's show in 2015 had a season at the National Gallery of Australia afterwards. The idea being that since there's been such substantial public money invested in this international event, it's also great if it can be shown as much as possible to the audiences back home. So is Venice more than a sales pitch? Is it still important in terms of the content of the art? I think it is, but I think it's all of these things, and sometimes they do really contradict each other. At these mega exhibitions, you see it all, the intrigues and the bun fights, the occasional scandals, quite serious ones, quite difficult ones, and as well as the main exhibition. So here's a little bit of what I saw in 2017, just this one year, where I saw some great work. This was the artist in the, just to give you a snapshot of the variety, this was the artist in the official pavilion for Great Britain. Her name is Philida Barlow, B-A-R-L-O-W. She's astonishing. She was then around 73. She was no longer teaching, and her 5 children had grown up. She's a sculptor, but a very astonishing sculptor. Many of the things are made out of wood or papier-mâché. Many of them play with scale, so that these enormous columns inside the rather grand rooms of the British Pavilion dominated the figures of us walking through. I thought it was absolutely joyous, a lot of fun. It played in a way that I think only a really, really sophisticated artist with a very long practice in sculpture can. She's quite remarkable, Philida, P-H-Y-L-L-I-D-A. When asked when she had time to do the work, she said, oh, well, mostly when the children were asleep and in bed. But it's wonderful sculpture, the colours, the forms, and I loved that British Pavilion because they served cups of tea in enamel mugs out the back. It's a particularly British kind of catering gesture. So there's Philida Barlow with playful, colourful sculpture, playing with scale, playing with colour, playing with forms. In the German pavilion, as I said, there was work by now a great star of contemporary art. Her name is Anne Imhoff, and she made a piece called Faust, which was absolutely the star of that Biennale. I saw the work 3 times. The second and the third times involved queuing for over an hour, but I needed to check. You see she's one of the people who has altered the pavilion. They took the floors out and replaced the floors with hardened glass, like that glass in the middle here, right across the very large rooms, which speaks to the amount of cultural investment that Germany is prepared to make. And this was a performance work. This was at the preview, and there I am photographing all the people who are attending. There were a group of young people performing gestures and making dance moves that seemed to speak of their isolation. They took no notice of the people in the room, though I know that the visitors crowded the performers, and it was very uncomfortable and difficult for them. And later on, they limited the numbers of people who went in. They also occupied spaces below the floors. It seemed to be, for some people, and Faust, of course, Faust and the pact with the devil and the idea of going down to hell below the floor. The whole work was so unjoyful in comparison to Philida Barlow's that it was frankly disliked by very many people at the event. They wanted something much more cheerful. But I found it astonishing. Some of the performers would emerge from below the glass floor and then come around and perform actually in the event. And she was semi-choreographing it by using mobile phones. So the technology was kind of simple. It wasn't as straightforward as it sounds. Can you imagine how many glitches there were? But still, they had a rough script, and they clung to it, and we all followed them from room to room. There are about 3 big rooms, watching as these exquisite young people seemed to be acting out a parable of their social isolation and their distance from each other in what looked like a very dystopian world. Now, this tells you also, after only 2 works, that this is not just a painting show. Philip de Barlow's big coloured painted things are close to sculpture, but a lot of the work is a hybrid of performance and other kinds of actions. Here's a work by a Taiwanese-American artist. This was in the main pavilion. This is called the Mending Project, and it's in the Arsenale. So you can see the beautiful columns and walls of the original rope factory have been supplemented by internal walls. Now, this work was shown in the Biennale of Sydney in 2012 at the MCA, and the idea is that you take something that you want mended, and you go there and the artist will talk to you and will mend your object. And then, can you see on the wall all the bobbins of thread? They will be then, in some circumstances, the threads from the bobbins will come down to where they are attached to the mended objects. The entire thing, unlike Anne Imhoff's Faust, is a parable of social connection, not about social dislocation or distance. And if I show you the next image, you'll see he became very good at quick embroidery. He started his life as a textile artist. And it's a very beautiful project that has been reproduced in many different locations, Sydney, in Tokyo, in the States, and here at the Venice Biennale in the main exhibition. And finally, in this little cook's tour of, if you'll forgive the pun, of what you might see at the Venice Biennale, here's this sensational work at the 2017 Biennale by the Maori artist Lisa Rehana, which is called In Pursuit of Venus Infected. So you can see that she's interested in Captain Cook's voyage in 1770 to the South Pacific because of the transit of Venus, which was his original reason for coming. It's based on some magnificent French wallpaper, which dates from 1804 to 5. A sample of that wallpaper is held in the National Gallery of Australia, right? And so what she did was she took this wallpaper, which is called Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique, the savages of the South Pacific, and she animated it using green screen and I wish I had some more details for you now, but all of those people are all costumed beautifully, and they animate various incidents from the Cook's voyages across the South Pacific. The whole thing runs for 30 minutes, just to take in the transit across the Pacific. It's not without its problems. It seems to suggest that the Pacific before colonization was Pacific, that there was no violence, no hierarchy, no slavery, and we know that that's not true. But nevertheless, it's a wonderful evocation of a voice coming from within inside the South Pacific attitude towards the Western European presence in the Pacific. It's a beautiful and astonishing thing, and it's now in many Australian collections as well. Now, this is a very pixelated map, I'm sorry, but I now need to turn to where we show as Australians. Australia has shown at the Venice Biennale on and off since 1954, when Nolan, Drysdale and Dobell had a group show in a rented pavilion, one of those ones through the city. But since 1986, we've been exhibiting regularly, and in 1988, a pavilion designed by the Australian architect Philip Cox opened as what was called a temporary structure. Right? Now, the temporary is very important. You have to hang on to that. And I can show you where it is if I just scamper over here. Can you see the river on the right-hand side running through the Green Park? That's the Rio. It's one of their words for a little river. And can you see the second bridge? The Australian Pavilion is just to the left of the second bridge. And on the other side, can you see a big white kind of blob? That's what I call the back lot. That's also part of the Giardini, and you go across that bridge and there's another whole lot of pavilions, including the beautiful Joseph Hoffman one of 1934 that I showed you. So it's been populated by by the Biennale for all of that time. Okay, now, this is what the Philip Cox Pavilion looked like. And you'll see that it's very light and very airy and, very Australian in its feeling. It was a beautiful small building, but it wasn't very well adapted for art or architecture. And some people in the art world used to refer to it rather derisively as a beach shack, though rather a beautiful beach shack by a very famous architect. So there is the river that I showed you in that rather bad satellite image. Now, I should just explain that this building, our pavilion, is used every year. In odd years, it used to be, now it's even, it was used for the Art Biennial, and then even years it was used for the Architecture Biennial. So Australia gets a great use out of its pavilion, as do all the other countries amongst the happy 29 that are allowed to have their pavilions on this site. It's a heritage site. No more buildings will ever be built. The Australian one was the last. But even though it looked great, as it did here in 1999 with Howard Arkley's The Home Show, it became increasingly evident that it was small and difficult, and while it was airy and casual and evoked Australian life, nevertheless it wasn't really great for contemporary art, because it was a series of small rooms, as if you were trying to put great hulking sculpture into a living room. How can you do that? So it became clear that we had outgrown it, and by 2011 and 12 it was decided to replace it, not without complaints from the architectural community. But that's what happened, and I can tell you what happened. In 2013, Simran Gill was the last Australian artist to show in the old pavilion, and because the pavilion was going to be demolished, she took the roof off and exposed some of the sculpture, like this beautiful big piece called Half Moon Shine, the big bowl, so that these could be exposed to the elements, so that the process of the weather and the wearing and the leaves and the general slight muddiness and the salt air that you get in Venice, which is so terrible for paintings and works on paper, that all of this would accumulate over the 6-month period. Now, by that stage, a guy in Melbourne called Ronnie D'Stasio had rescued the Australian government from the embarrassment of a pavilion it didn't want anymore. He runs a restaurant, he's a great guy, he's an art collector, and he came up with a great solution. He said he would buy the pavilion and relocate it to his winery in Victoria. Everyone is happy. Everyone is very happy. Now, Simran Gill's exhibition was titled Here Art Grows on Trees. Her curator, the Belgian Catherine de Zager, described it as, and I quote, a space of negotiation between the small and the global, between nature and industry, as it reveals an understanding of the interconnectedness of all the world in flux. Why did she move, as I said, why did she take the roof off? To show how each moment was part of that flux. So if you look at this image here, yes, there's the great Half Moon Shine, which is a truly wonderful thing, but the photographs on the back are of mining sites in the Pilbara. So there's immediately a connection between the iron ore that is mined and the way sculptors, or this particular artist, has used that iron ore, used steel to make this gigantic bowl. This is the lower section of the pavilion. It was you couldn't see from my previous photographs, but it's a double height, it was a double story, and you went downstairs, which just added to the difficulty of using it. So there were 4 major works that she showed. The beautiful Half Moon Shine, which is a great gilded steel bowl created to specific requirements in India, which collected water and leaves, and the photo suite Eyes and Storms. So I said mining sites. But Gill is not very straightforward, not at all. She asks us to think about the devastation of mining, but also about the necessity of its products. And as a deep thinker, she's actually very bookish, and that's a kind of intentional pun because many of her works are made from books. Like this one, for example, Let's Go, where she's torn up, she's torn up little books, and they're like little insects proliferating across the wall. They were very delicate, only about sort of this big, as much as my fingers are describing. And this was a kind of a large, ephemeral, beautiful, decaying, in that open-roofed environment, decaying set of works. They were definitely decomposing in the humid Venetian summer. Now, other works are more elliptical, but some are actually very straightforward. Naut, spelled N-A-U-G-H-T, is entirely made of circles, noughts, zeros, which are made of found materials. She often uses found materials, bits of plastic, bits of steel, things that she scavenges, whether it's from her home in Sydney or sometimes from the Malacca Straits. And this is just down the hill from her parents' home in Port Dickson in coastal Malaysia on the Straits of Malacca. I said she was interested in flux. Catherine de Zager said she was interested in the interconnectedness of things in the world. Sometimes she indicates that by looking at the way the tide brings things in from that very famous shipping road, the Straits of Malacca. It's amazing. And this sort of image, some were black and white, some were colour, where you can see that some marine rope has come loose from a vessel, and here it is tangled up with the mangroves which are at the bottom of the hill. She says she's an empty maker. She finds things on her walks, whether in Marrickville or in Malacca or in Port Dickson. So, this Venice exhibition for Gill, did it lead on to much greater exposure? Indeed it did. The Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired this series channel. I'm only showing you two. There are more than 30. So she is an artist with an international reputation who shows very widely, and there's absolutely no doubt that Venice was one of the moments which just propelled her career into a completely different set of conversations with artists all over the world. The next artist at the Venice Biennale was Fiona Hall. Does anyone know Fiona Hall's work? Oh, well, I hope that this is a great surprise. But Fiona Hall showed in the new pavilion, and this is it. All of that idea about making a new pavilion was realised. 82 different donors gave millions of dollars, about $6 million. All sorts of people contributed, and a new pavilion was commissioned from the Melbourne firm Denton Corker Marshall. And if you'll forgive the pun, it is a corker. It is a fantastic building. Unlike the white buildings, the Australians decided to go black. So if anyone has any doubt, they can say it's that black building near the bridge, which is, wayfinding is always a good idea. It's approached by a ramp that you can see quite clearly in this photograph. It's accessible. And I think I absolutely have to tell you that one of the donors, Rachel Griffith, the actor, said she would definitely donate as long as she was allowed to have the keys to the toilets while she was visiting the Venice Biennale, because actually finding a toilet in any pavilion, let alone the public ones, is always a struggle. So I thought that was a very good deal, no? Wise woman. That's what it looks like from the riverside. Please observe the blank wall, because you'll see other shots, including one of Judy's, that show that the walls don't have to be blank. And can you see on the right-hand side, that's the veranda. So it has an accessible ramp, and it has the Great Australian Veranda outside the box, which is wonderful for entertaining. And down below, see where that overhang is? That's where the green room is. And unlike the nightmare of installing in the previous iteration, they just bring the barges up. The art comes up the river on the barge. It's the only way, and gets unloaded there and directly into the lower level, where a lift takes it up to the exhibition floor, unlike what they have to do in the other pavilions built in 1920, where they have to lug things upstairs, and it's a nightmare. So our pavilion is the envy. Believe me, it's the envy. And I've seen morbid and very senior European curators looking around and looking glum and telling us how much they envied it. I want to point out too that the Australian government put in $1.5 million. All the rest was raised by public subscription. I think it cost about $7.5 million, a very good deal. How did we build this pavilion? Because the Philip Cox building had been classified as temporary. And while there was meant to be no new building on the site of the Giardini, by that miracle of Italian bureaucratic reasoning, it was classified as temporary, therefore it could be replaced by something else. Someone did a very good negotiation there. So there's been a big change in this structure. It reoriented the entrance, and it's really simple. This is before it was occupied. You can just see past this entrance foyer with the desk on the left, and the staircase to the toilets is out of vision on the right of your image. Inside, it's just a plain box where you can build or do anything that you like at all, a classic modernist space. It was a huge success, as I said. Here's the opening. Here's Fiona Hall speaking to us all from the veranda at the opening in 2015. I think the person in the middle distance with the plaid trousers and red hair is Elizabeth Ann McGregor from the MCA, always easy to spot her in a crowd. It was a fantastic success. And the opening ceremony was all bells and whistles. There was a smoking ceremony, and you can see Rupert Meyer, in the glasses the architect John Denton, Kate Blanchett wearing Armani very beautifully. She was one of the donors, and the commissioner Simon Mordaunt, and nobody knows who that photobombing person is on the right. But it was fabulous. It was really quite something, you know. It was a great gig. Hall produced a wonderful exhibition called Wrong Way Time. She's been exhibiting since 1974, when she was still a student, both in Australia and internationally, and she rose to the occasion in 2015 by showing Wrong Way Time. She said, the theme is really about environmental degradation. She wanted to talk about what she called, and I quote, the madness, badness, and sadness of the world today. She's wordy as well as Simran is wordy. In recent years, she's engaged very seriously with themes of global trade and global responsibility. And in her own words, my concerns are the political state of the world and how it emotively impacts on the lives of us all, and also parallel to that, the environmental state of the world. Her signature materials are always chosen for the core meaning of each project, whether it's gathered driftwood, as you see here in this work called Manahiri, which is a Maori word for travellers, driftwood that came down a river from forests, from a deforested area. So she's made a very simple collection of them, and that's Fiona Hall, who doesn't like having her photograph taken. Many photographers don't like having their photographs taken, I've found out. But she chooses her materials for the core meaning of each project, so it had to be the driftwood here. And this beautiful work, the notorious sardine cans, these ones were chosen because they spoke about botanical classification. So this was a very large work called Paradisus Terrestris, the earthly paradise. It was based on the very first encyclopedia of gardens in English, which is 17th century. And this one is about the lotus, and here we have the navel, for navel gazing for the lotus. I can tell you later on, but you need 2 tins to make these works. One, she carves them, cuts them, uses spoons, does it on her kitchen table, uses scissors. If anybody finds an old stash in a country shop anywhere of sardines that still have the key instead of the pull tin, please let us know. Fiona Hall is still looking for them. Okay? Now, the materials speak to us because we know them intimately. We know it's a sardine can, but it's been magically transformed. We know that this is a banknote, but this work, when my boat comes in, displays boats. There's lots of boats in contemporary art because of this image always of global exchange and trade and the interconnectedness I spoke about. We know that these are banknotes, right? And this one in particular has pine. She uses the banknotes from the country of origin of the plant. So again, reinforcing the idea that the plant is the product that comes from a country and it also is exchanged for cash. Now, all of this was shown in a kind of a Wunderkammer, a kind of a beautiful conglomeration, a sort of mini survey. And here you can see, remarkably, exact copies of birds' nests made out of shredded $1 American bills. Yes, I acquired the work for the Queensland Art Gallery, where it still lives. I'm a very, very happy woman. There are 83 exact copies of birds' nests, and the work is called tender because of the nurturing of the nest, but also because legal tender. And each one is unique. Even though there are a number of weaver bird nests, the ones that hang down, those of you who are ornithologically inclined, each one is completely distinct for its own location. She used birds' nests from the Queensland Museum, the South Australian Museum, precisely because she wanted tropical birds and she wanted dry climate birds. So there's also birds from Sri Lanka where she has done residencies. And you can see all the sorts of different materials that she used. You can see banknotes. There's far too many works to show you, but I do want to show you this one. All the King's Men, remarkably, knitted ghostly hanging heads, knitted from torn up camouflage uniforms. And for those of us who are knitters, the spooky thing about this woman is she will knit a three-dimensional form without a pattern, just doing it as she goes. Now that is the next best thing to creepy, really. But at any rate, astonishing and ghostly, and these works are now in the collection of the Art Gallery of South Australia. The theme of memento mori, of death and of mourning, has become much more prominent in her work in recent years. But sometimes it really is the reflection on the environment, the death of the environment. This work has no title. I love it madly. It really is a great big block of coal, very appropriate for the hunter. And above that is something that might be lungs or might be a tree, again made out of Coca-Cola cans, aluminium cans that she's cut up and just manipulated in the simplest way possible. So it's very polemical in the way that it has a breathing structure next to a fossil fuel. And that one is now in a private collection in Sydney. All this was dazzling and confounding, and her work is very complex and very dense. It's not 30-second art. But these different ideas and materials did cohere through that environmental theme that I mentioned. The clocks, there were a lot of clocks, as if the Earth's biological clock was in fact ticking. It was a huge success. It was seen by over 250,000 people, and she continues to have a very lively international career. In 2017, the remarkable Tracy Moffatt, she always takes a good picture, showed she was the first solo Indigenous Australian artist to show in the official pavilion. And this is her at Middlehead at her press preview, which was a very dramatic and very pointed location. You saw in Judy's photograph before, she called her exhibition My Horizon. And can you see that big image on the front of the pavilion? There are some flaps that open out, and she used them for projections from behind. And look at this side. You see this side this is the side from the little river. Can you see now that there is actually a flap sticking out from the building as well as the title? She utilised this potential, which actually normally opens up as windows, right? You can have light coming into the building. She used these in order to dramatise what she did. But inside, it was several suites of her very, very well-known photographs. This particular one called Passage Set, a kind of elliptical narrative about a mother and her child, about loss. Strange characters, a strange film noir kind of ambience, beautiful C-type photographs, big. Each of them, as you can see, is 150 centimetres long, 1.5 meters long, and in a kind of a suite which gestured at a narrative, a mysterious narrative. It seems to relate to the idea of a refugee mother. It seems to have to do with childhood and loss. In the back room, the work that I liked very much, there were videos, and this video on the left-hand wall was in fact the one which was shown outside on those screens, an excellent device. But the work I want to stress was this wonderful work called The Body Remembers. That's the major installation of them here. And here I think I know where in Western Queensland, pretty roughly, this was photographed. There are these kinds of rubble buildings in Western Queensland from these enormous sheep and cattle stations, which are now pretty much abandoned. Out the back of Ewington, you can find these places. They're amazing. Now, there's a big story behind this. Moffatt is probably Australia's most internationally successful artist. A Queenslander originally, she's been exhibiting since the mid-80s. Born in 1960, lived in suburban Mount Gravatt. But Moffatt and her siblings were adopted from an Aboriginal mother by a white family and trained in film and in photography. I think it's fair to say that from that time, her work has been entirely about the conundrum of how she locates herself and what her identity is as an Aboriginal person brought up without language, without culture, and in a white context. She's had a very big presence internationally. She lived overseas in New York from 1997 for 12 years. Now, these images, and this is Moffatt herself, she often performs in her own work. These images relate to the history of domestic servitude in rural Queensland. Her great-grandmother and actually her grandmother were both servants on these estates. The name Moffatt comes from the station at Mount Moffatt in Western Queensland. She's very, very attuned to movies. She's a film scholar, she's a photography scholar, she's very, very knowledgeable, and you can see memories or hints of other movies, particularly film noir, as you look at these setups that she's devised, studio setups. But she also went out to this area, and some of the images I love best are these manipulated sepia shadows, as if, in fact, this body is remembering the past or remembering the history of her female progenitors when her great-grandmother Maggie was in service near there in 1910. Actually, her mother Daphne was also in service, and if we're going to be completely honest, we may as well call it by its real name, which was slavery, right? It's a poignant thing, remembering the body of her forebears. It's very close to home. But she's also a practical creature. There's Moffatt, right in the middle. Can you see her with her arms crossed? And all of those people are part of the Indigenous curatorial emerging crew that were sponsored to go to Venice and to meet other people from other First Nations delegations. So she's very proactive and very engaged in the art training and development of other professionals from the Indigenous community, a very generous soul. Now, galloping right along here, the last person I want to show you, what's happening here? It's stopping on me, okay, that might work. The wonderful Angelica Massetti. Italian name, Italian name, Italian-Australian family. The youngest artist so far, she was 43 when she showed in Venice in 2019. Now she lives in Paris. She's lived in Paris for about a decade, and she's known for these beautiful video works. So her work was video. I'll show you just two images from a work I love called Citizens Band in its original installation. Each one of the 4 episodes shows music. This woman from Cameroon is doing something very traditional. She's drumming on the water. That's what they do with the rivers. If you drum on the water, the sound carries. And it's just, she's just in a Paris swimming pool, but you can drum on the water and you can hear it a long way away. The next person was this blind Berber from North Africa. He's playing a kind of harmonium and singing in the metro. There are two other images. I didn't have to be told that the man doing throat singing was in Newtown in Sydney. I could tell just by looking at it. And the other one is a Sudanese taxi driver in Brisbane, and he's whistling like you've never heard whistling. And the citizens are all playing their music. And she shows them one after the other. And again, it's a theme that the artists today in Australia are very interested in, the combinations of the different communities that we have here and how people negotiate the boundaries of those communities and how we all communicate together. Masiti's very interested in ideas about communication. This particular work, which was on display at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, that's the national contemporary art venue. This one is called Mother Tongue, and it did the same sort of thing in the city of Aarhus in Denmark, looking at vocal and singing performances from different communities, whether they were Palestinian or a wonderful middle-aged Egyptian singer or local folk dancing. She's interested in communication through music and through gesture, and that's what she works with nearly all the time. Occasionally the work is more whimsical. This is called Prepared Piano for Movers, Hausmann, and it actually shows two movers taking a piano up a staircase with terrible results, and the piano makes noise. So it refers to the idea of the prepared piano that musicians like John Cage and Steve Reich were involved with. And I saw it actually in Auckland, installed at the top of a spiral staircase in an old building. So it's a lovely, whimsical, funny piece. The piece for Venice was more portentous, and if I'm going to be completely honest, it's not the piece of hers that I love the best, but it does bear on why people do things for big international shows. This one is based on this machine, right? The work is called Assembly, and again it brings together different kinds of performers, some of which I'll show you. But it was based on this machine. It's called a Michela machine, M-I-C-H-E-L-A. It's a transcription machine which was invented to transcribe the activities of the Italian Parliament, which was a new thing, right? And so this guy who lived in the 19th century adapted a kind of keyboard in order to be a stenographic machine. She used it to code a poem by David Malouf, and that poem was called To Be Written in Another Tongue. And that was then recoded into a musical score. I do think it got a little bit complicated, but the score allowed different performing groups to appear. This beautiful Aboriginal dancer, for example, is in a room, a very particular room in Old Parliament House. Do you see the crowns? The Queen used the room when she came on the tour in 1954, huh? So it's been left there. Crowns in aspic, in glass cases. And this woman is making various hand gestures. So there's this competition between different signifying and communicating systems. And here, a wonderful band of Lebanese drummers who dance and drum to particular rhythms at the same time. Okay. The curator, Juliana Engbird, said, "In Assembly, Angelica translates text to coded music, to movement and actions, to occupations, to represent the way the society gathers and builds upon itself." It was an image of cooperation and harmony, ultimately, which was a beautiful message for that moment. A complex work, but I think I love the simpler ones better. And again, she did something that I think maybe you shouldn't do. She got involved in the idea of the Australian Parliament and the Italian Parliament and put them together. And I felt like saying, strip back, strip back. I'm a huge fan of her work. This is a question of degree, by the way, and so beautifully done. Big installation. You walked into the pavilion, completely dark, and you sat in a big red carpeted arena and you watched the screens. This year's artist was to have been a man called Fuzzinato, who's another Italian-Australian from Melbourne, and he is being put off to next year. It's not going to happen. He's a wonderful artist who works a lot with music, and this hilarious work, Constellations, was in fact a wall and a baseball bat, and it was wired up to speakers so that when you picked up the bat, which I did, and whacked it on the wall, you got the best drumming sound that you have ever heard in your entire life. And of course, the wall marked every time it was hit. Simple and effective. He has much more complex work. This is one of the simple ones. And he will do something, I think, quite spectacular, but not until the middle of next year. And yes, Angelica Massetti has had wonderful opportunities out of Venice. As I said, she lives in Paris, so she already had a European audience. All this art aside, is Venice itself perhaps the biggest show in its own town? This beautiful old city is a challenging setting for contemporary art. What can rival, after all, Venice's celebrated beauty and its fabulous art, its often brutal history? There is certainly a particular frisson in seeing the latest art in this astonishing and sedimented setting, in finding future ideas amongst the vestiges of past glory. And by the way, they need to do this tourism, cultural tourism, to pay for the renovation of these buildings. And in all my time of going to the Arsenale, I've been going since 1990, gradually buildings are renovated. The fabric of these historical buildings is renovated, and you can see that every year something else has been paid for. This is what makes the Venice Biennale for me. It's the combination of the old and the new. It's incomparable improbability. Dickens said of Venice that it was beyond the fancy of the wildest dreamer. Opium couldn't build such a place. He was obviously thinking of Coleridge's Kubla Khan and the stately pleasure domes, right? And in 1961, Truman Capote famously said, "Venice is like eating an entire box of chocolate liqueurs in one go." But I'll leave you on a sobering image. This is obviously an ocean liner from the heady days of rampant, out-of-control tourism. Since 2010, Venice has annually had between 20 and 30 million visitors each year. Perhaps those days have already gone. Since this 2015 photo, COVID has come and come again, and Venice, like all of Italy, has suffered dreadfully, and its tourism-dependent economy has been shattered. In Venice, as in so many other places, it's clearly time for a rethink. And maybe there is a change in sight. Only a couple of weeks ago, the national government, which is not to be trusted, has announced its intention of building a new cruise ship port near Marghera on the nearby mainland to receive the 1.6 million people who come on these cruise ships. I think you know the problem. They come, they don't spend any money, they don't pay any fees, they don't pay any taxes. Venice doesn't make anything from this. The national government is what makes the money from this. At any rate, this is what used to happen. Perhaps it will no longer, we will see. COVID has changed so much, and perhaps out of all this we might hope for a better future for Venice as one unexpected consequence. What I can say, though, is that Australian artists will, even under this difficult and changed situation, still be showing our art in this most important international arena. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Oh, thank you, Julie. Just before I thank Julie, she's very happy to answer some questions. So if you have a question for her and raise your hand, I'll run down with the microphone Are there any questions?
Oh, good.
I would just like to ask, what vineyard in Melbourne or in Victoria did the old building go to?
I'm sorry. Oh, Ronnie DeSazio has a vineyard of his own, and you've asked me the one question I can't answer, unless it's called DeSazio wine or something, but it's in country Victoria. Yeah, and it was a lovely building, but it just wasn't an art gallery. Yeah, and Philip Cox is a great architect. So, anyone else?
No more?
Also
Right.
happy to chat down the back. You know, are we allowed to chat down the back, or do we have to leave?
Oh, well, sort of.
Okay, thank you very much.
We can test it. Just before I thank you, we have another job to do.
What's that?
So
Oh, the
Kathy,
raffle.
can you do this and I'll take a photograph? We need the person who wins it to.
I haven't got my glasses on, I can't see a thing. That's good.